Don't show up in your cheap coat and embarrass us, the text message read. The local media and the city's top donors will be everywhere tonight. Julian is receiving the hospital's highest medical merit award for the new $15 million wing. We can't have you looking like a charity case in front of the Sterling family. I sat in the driver's seat of my dented 2011 Chevy Silverado, the engine idling with a low, rough murmur that rattled the loose change in the cup holder. The phone screen cast a cold blue glow onto my palms, hands that had spent 40 years holding surgical bone saws, clamping ruptured femoral arteries, and stitching shattered joints back together in sterile military operating rooms. I rubbed my thumb over the edge of the screen, then glanced down at my sleeve. It was a heavy brown canvas coat, the fabric sans queue at the cuffs, showing thin white threads where the lining had taken years of friction. My wife, Martha, had bought it for me at a farm supply store 12 winters ago, right before the cancer took her. It wasn't fancy. It didn't have a designer label, but it kept the Ohio wind out of my chest, and it reminded me of the only person who ever truly understood why I walked away from a lucrative private practice to work for people who couldn't pay me back. Before I tell you my story, please leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, welcome to our Father's Raw Justice channel. The text had come from my daughter Clara, but the syntax wasn't hers. Clara was a gentle girl, a bit fragile around the edges, the kind of person who spent her 20s trying to design beautiful interiors because the messy reality of the world frightened her. No, those words belonged to Julian Sterling, her husband of 5 years and the executive director of administration at the Nova Crest Medical System. Julian was 38, wore pinstripe suits that required 3 fittings downtown, and spoke with the loud, performative confidence of a man who believed the world was in stage built entirely for his advancement. To Julian, my existence was a mild, persistent stain on his carefully curated social resume. For the past 6 years, since retiring as chief of trauma surgery from the Veterans Hospital, I had run St. Jude's free clinic in the south end of Cincinnati. It was an old brick building with high ceilings that smelled of rubbing alcohol and ancient floor wax. My patients were retired railroad workers, line cooks without insurance, and mothers trying to stretch a paycheck between formula and antibiotics. We didn't do cosmetic upgrades or high-end diagnostic suites. We patched up fractures, managed high blood pressure, and made sure people kept their dignity when their bodies failed them. Julian called it a neck-knock operation. He told Clara that my choice to spend my retirement in a rundown neighborhood was a sign of early cognitive decline, or worse, a stubborn refusal to let his family climb into the city's elite circles. I didn't answer the text, I didn't type out a furious defense, and I didn't call Clara to demand an apology. When you spend decades opening up human chests under pressure, you learn that shouting never stops a bleed. You don't react, you assess the load. You look at the monitor, check the vitals, and plan the incision. I put the phone in my pocket, threw the truck into reverse, and backed out of the small gravel lot behind the clinic. The drive through Cincinnati was quiet, the gray September evening settling over the hills like a wet blanket. I thought about the $300,000 I had quietly wired into Julian's personal account 3 years ago when he claimed he needed an emergency bridge loan to cover an unexpected real estate tax evaluation on their home in Hyde Park. He had promised to return it within 6 months. He never did. Instead, he bought a newer Porsche Cayenne, and the next time he came to my house, he spent 20 minutes explaining why my old silver spoons were a terrible investment. I had stayed silent then, too. Martha always told me that family was a ledger where you sometimes had to write off the debts just to keep the peace. But there is a point where peace becomes permission. When I pulled up to my modest home in Columbia, Tusculum, Clara's car was already in the driveway. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, a linen folder spread out in front of her. She looked up, her expression a mix of nervous affection and defensive posture. "Dad," she said, standing up to kiss my cheek. She smelled of expensive perfume and anxiety. "You didn't text me back. I wanted to make sure you weren't upset about the gala." "I was finishing up a chart, Clara," I said, hung up my canvas coat on the wooden peg by the door. I walked to the counter and poured myself a cup of black coffee from the pot that had been sitting there since noon. "Your text was clear enough." She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her fingers tapping against the edge of the table. Julian is just under a massive amount of stress. The board is looking at him for the regional vice president seat next month. This wing, it's his legacy, Dad. Every major political figure in the county is going to be there. He just needs everything to look flawless. And my coat isn't flawless, I murmured, taking a slow sip. It's not just the coat, Dad, she said, her voice dropping into that rhythmic, rehearsed tone that usually meant Julian had spent the previous evening talking at her. It's the image. People see you driving that old truck, working in that neighborhood. They ask questions. Julian's colleagues think you're struggled. They wonder why the family doesn't take care of you. It makes Julian look like he's failing his own people. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. I saw the faint purple shadows under her eyes, the tight pull of her mouth, and the way she avoided looking directly at the framed photograph of her mother on the sideboard. Julian hadn't just changed her wardrobe. He had remapped her logic. He had made her believe that my 40 years of service were a liability, and that his $15 million sandcastle was the only structure that mattered. I see, I said, setting the mug down with a soft click. Is there something else, Clara? You didn't drive across town just to talk about my wardrobe. She looked down at the table, her hand resting on the linen folder. She opened it, pulling out a 3-page document printed on heavy bond paper with the Nova Crest legal letterhead at the top. Julian needs you to look at this, she said softly, sliding it toward me. It's a standard zoning and property allocation clearance for the St. Jude's lot. The hospital system is doing a regional expansion assessment, and because the clinic sits on the edge of the old rail corridor, they need the title transferred into the corporate trust to complete the development blueprint. Julian says it's just a formality. He said it'll help protect the clinic's long-term utility. I didn't pick up the paper. I stood there, arms crossed, looking at the bold print at the bottom of the page, irrevocable transfer of real property and title sovereignty. They didn't just want me out of their sight, they wanted the ground beneath my feet. The silence in my kitchen was so heavy I could hear the refrigerator compressor kick on. Its dull vibration hummed through the linoleum under my boots. I didn't reach for the folder Clara had slid across the table. I just let it sit there on the worn oak surface, right next to my coffee mug, like a biopsy report neither of us wanted to open. Julian says, it's just a formality, Dad, Clara repeated, her voice rising slightly at the end, a nervous pitch she'd had since she was a little girl, trying to convince herself that a broken vase had fallen on its own. The hospital system has to clear all property tags along the transit corridor before they can secure the final county bond for the international wing. It's a standard corporate roll-up. A standard roll-up, I murmured, my voice level. I picked up my mug, took a long, slow sip of the black coffee, and looked at the top page of the document through the lower half of my bifocals. My eyes didn't track the broad corporate jargon about regional utility and zoning frameworks. They went straight to the numbers, the dates, and the specific statutory references hidden in the third paragraph. 40 years in medicine teaches you how to look past the surface symptoms to find the actual pathology. When a patient walks into the ER with a slightly swollen calf and a mild fever, a bad doctor gives them antibiotics and sends them home. A surgeon who has worked in military trauma bays looks for the deep vein thrombosis, the silent clot that's about to travel up to the lungs and stop the heart. Julian's document was a blood clot. The paperwork didn't just ask for a routine boundary easement or a temporary construction right-of-way for the St. Jude lot. It was an irrevocable title sovereignty transfer. If I signed that paper, the land beneath the clinic, a prime 3/4-acre commercial lot in the South End that my father had bought in 1954 and passed down to me free and clear, would become the absolute, permanent property of Nova Crest Medical Systems real estate subsidiary. And the compensation line for the current owner was a single, flat field, $0, executed as a voluntary civic contribution. Clara, I said, setting the mug down without a sound. Did you read page 2? She shifted her weight, her designer flats creaking against the floor. Julian explained it to me on the drive over, Dad. He said the hospital trust will absorb the clinic's operating liabilities. It frees you up from the overhead. You won't have to worry about the roof leaks or the medical waste contracts anymore. You can just Treat your patients until you're ready to fully retire. Julian told you that, I said. Yes, she said, her chin tightening with that defensive loyalty she always used when she knew her husband was crossing a line. He spent 3 hours working on these codicils last night. He's trying to include your clinic in the hospital's master legacy, Dad. He's doing this for us, for the family. I looked at the folder, then stood up, took the paper out of the sleeve, and walked over to the kitchen counter where the old land ledger from my father's estate was kept. I didn't sign it. Instead, I folded the document neatly in half, slipped it into the inner pocket of my canvas coat hanging by the door, and turned back to my daughter. Tell Julian I need to review the historical foundation charters before I execute a title shift, I said softly. A property held for 70 years requires a proper legal audit. I'll give him his answer at the hospital board meeting on Thursday morning. Clara blinked, her fingers tightening around her leather handbag. The board meeting? Dad, no. The board meeting is a private executive session right before the gala. Julian is presenting his final infrastructure audit to the senior trustees at 5 o'clock. He doesn't want... he said there's no reason for you to be bogged down in the administrative logistics. I'm not logged down, Clara, I said, offering her a brief, dry smile that didn't reach my eyes. I'm a property owner protecting his title. Tell him I'll see him Thursday. After she left, the house felt entirely too large. I sat at my desk in the small back office, the room where I kept my old military medical logs and the private financial files Julian always assumed were empty. I picked up my phone and dialed a 10-digit number I hadn't called in almost 14 months. It rang twice. Thomas, the voice on the other end said, deep and deliberate, the voice of a man who spent his life speaking in courtrooms where a single misplaced syllable could cost $10 million. I was just looking at the weather report for Cincinnati. I figured you were buried under some early autumn rain. Arthur, I said, leaning back in my chair and looking out the window at the gray evening settling over Columbia Tusculum. I need an extraction, not a medical one, a financial one. Arthur Cole didn't ask a string of frantic questions. He didn't gaslight me or tell me everything was probably a misunderstanding. 15 years ago, Arthur had been brought into my operating room at the military hospital with a shattered right pelvis and a severed internal iliac artery after a structural steel failure at a municipal construction site. The on-call orthopedic team had already signed the authorization form to amputate his leg at the hip to control the hemorrhage. I tore that form up, spent 7 hours in the heat of a July night reconstruction of his arterial wall with a synthetic graft, and spent another 3 hours pinning his pelvic ring back together piece by piece. Today, Arthur walks with a slight limp, but he walks on his own 2 feet, and he serves as the senior managing partner at Cole, Vance, and Sterling Financial, the private asset firm that managed my hidden family interests. Give me the name, Thomas, Arthur said quietly. Julian Sterling, I replied. Nova Crest Medical System. He's attempting an accelerated title seizure on the St. Jude property under an emergency zoning clearance. I want to know why a man running a $15 million hospital expansion is sweating over a 3/4-acre clinic lot in the old rail district. Give me 12 hours, Arthur said. I'll run the internal forensic audit through the Capitol Registry. Don't sign anything, Thomas, not a line. I haven't signed a thing since 1982, Arthur, I said, and hung up. By 10 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting in my office at the clinic. A line of 4 patients was already waiting in the hallway, an assembly line of old joints, worn discs, and high blood pressure charts. At 11:30, my phone buzzed with an encrypted PDF notification from Arthur's private server. I opened the document on my tablet while my lunch sat untouched on the edge of the desk. What the audit had found took 60 pages to fully map, but the baseline reality was simple. Tron true, and completely devastating. Julian Sterling hadn't built a $15 million medical wing. He had built a massive, hollow shell. Over the past 18 months, Julian had quietly redirected $4.5 million from Novacrest's Capital Infrastructure Fund into an offshore real estate partnership registered in the Cayman Islands. He had been using the hospital's operational liquidity to speculate on high-risk, unlisted commercial properties that had completely collapsed during the mid-year interest rate adjustments. The money was gone. frozen in liquidation courts 3,000 miles away, but the county hospital board was scheduled to conduct their supreme fiscal review on Thursday evening, right before the ribbon-cutting ceremony. If the state auditors looked at the ledger and saw a $4.5 million deficit in the construction escrow account, Julian wouldn't just lose his chance at the regional vice presidency. He would be walking out of Nova Crest in handcuffs. He needed my clinic lot because he had already quietly pre-sold the land to a commercial storage developer for $5 million cash, using a forged letter of intent with my name at the bottom to secure an immediate closing date for Friday morning. He was going to use my father's land to plug the hole in his own theft before the board ever noticed the bleed. I closed the file, set the tablet down on the blotter, and rubbed my eyes. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle into the center of my chest, the exact same feeling I used to get when an artery blew under my clamps and the room turned dead silent. Julian had miscalculated the weight. He thought he was dealing with an old retired charity doctor who could be pushed out of the way with a sharp text message in a linen folder. He had no idea he had just walked into the operating room of a trauma surgeon who knew exactly where to make the incision. The rain had stopped by Thursday morning, leaving the Cincinnati streets slick and black under a pale, filtered sun. I didn't drive the Chevy Silverado to the Nova Crest executive headquarters downtown. Instead, I parked it 3 blocks away in a municipal garage, walked through the damp autumn air, and entered the pristine glass and steel tower through the side employee transit entrance. Inside the 14th floor conference room, the atmosphere didn't smell like a celebration. It smelled like panic. I stood in the shadows of the secondary gallery, just beyond the thick oak double doors of the private executive boardroom. Through the glass panels, I could see the senior trustees of the hospital network scrambling over leather folders and spread files. At the head of the long walnut table sat Arthur Cole, his face a slate of absolute unhurried neutrality. He set his gold-rimmed reading glasses on the table, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit, and looked toward the doorway with the calm precision of a man who had already calculated every variable in the room. "We have an emergency capital crisis," a senior board member was saying, his voice tight, dropping into that defensive pitch administrators use when the foundation begins to crack beneath them. "The state auditors just flagged an anomaly in the new specialist wing's construction escrow. There is a $4.5 million liquidity TEM hut. If that gap isn't verified and filled before the governor arrives for the ribbon-cutting gala tonight, the municipal bond defaults. The entire network collapses by tomorrow morning." Julian Sterling sat 3 seats down, his pinstripe suit immaculate, his silk tie perfectly knotted. He didn't look like a man who had stolen $4.5 million to gamble on offshore real estate ma. He leaned forward, tapping his fountain pen against a linen folder with a comfortable, performative confidence. "The escrow is fully accounted for, gentlemen," Julian said, his voice level, carrying that broad administrative authority that had fooled the board for 3 years. "It's a routine logistical delay in property tagging. St. Jude's Clinic in the South End sits exactly on the corridor clearance line. I have the irrevocable title, Sovereignty Transfer executed by the owner. We close the off-market cash sale to our logistics development group for $5 million at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The cash clears by noon. The gap is closed." He slid a 3-page document printed on heavy bond paper with the Nova Crest legal letterhead across the table. At the bottom of the last page, beneath the bold print reading, "Irrevocable Transfer of Real Property," sat a signature line. Julian had already filled it in with a clean, dark ink blueprint. My father's name, my name, both forged with the steady hand of an AI key who believed the old charity doctor would never show up to read the ledger. Arthur Cole didn't pick up the paper. He didn't blink. He looked at Julian through a long, heavy silence, the kind of silence that commands a room far better than volume ever could. "Mr. Sterling," Arthur said quietly, his voice deep and deliberate, "before you include that asset in the balance sheet, you need to understand the structural history of the debt underwriting this entire $15 million wing." Julian laughed, a short, dry sound that had no humor in it. "The underwriting is standard county bond placement, Arthur. We don't need a lecture on finance logistics right before a media gala." "It isn't standard," Arthur replied, leaning back in his chair and opening a separate thick leather folder. 65% of the total construction debt for this hospital system is held through private, anonymous mortgage certificates. Those certificates were purchased 10 years ago by Apex Capital Trust. And in that trust agreement, page 6, paragraph 14, there is a very specific safety policy covenant. Julian's pen stopped tapping. His jaw worked through a brief involuntary twitch, but his mask of control stayed intact. What covenant? A breach of fiduciary duty clause, Arthur said, sliding a single page across the table toward the board members. If the chief administrative director of the hospital network is found to have engaged in unauthorized capital redirection, material misrepresentation, or asset forgery, the entire $15 million balance becomes immediately callable. 30 days' notice is waived. Apex Capital has the absolute non-negotiable right to demand full repayment within 24 hours. If the funds are not produced, the hospital enters automatic technical default, and the title to the entire facility passes to the trust. A collective gasp went through the board members. The folder was snatched up, pages flipped, fingers traced down the legal text where the sticky arrows had been placed. "This is ridiculous." Julian stood up, his face flushing dark against his crisp white collar. He pointed a finger at Arthur. "Apex Capital has been a silent partner for a decade. They have never once conducted an operational evaluation. Who authorized a forensic capital audit on my project?" "I did," Arthur Cole said levelly. "You don't have the sovereignty to act alone, Arthur," Julian sneered, his corporate voice rising, trying to dominate the space. "You are a managing trustee. You report to the principal investor of the Apex Fund, and that investor has been a ghost in New York for 20 years. "He isn't in New York, Julian," Arthur said softly, turning his head toward the double doors at the back of the boardroom. "And he isn't a ghost." Arthur nodded once, a sharp professional signal that cut through the panic in the room like a scalpel. I reached out my hand, pushed the heavy oak doors open, and walked into the executive boardroom of Novacrest Medical System. I wasn't wearing a Savile Row suit. I hadn't changed into designer clothes to prove my position to the people at that table. I was wearing my heavy brown canvas coat, the one with the sun coup fabric at the cuffs and the thin white threads showing at the lining. The exact coat Julian had sent a sharp text message to ban from his site. Julian stared at me, his eyes widening, his comfortable confidence dissolving from his face like grease under hot water. The pen slipped from his fingers, clattering against his crystal water glass with a sharp, hollow ring that sounded exactly like a door closing. "What is the meaning of this, Thomas?" Julian's voice cracked, the carefully practiced corporate polish stripped away in a single second. He looked down at the floor, then back at me, his fingers trembling against the mahogany edge of the table. "You were told to stay away. The security team. They shouldn't have allowed a civilian into an executive chamber." "I am not a civilian in this room, Julian," I said, my voice carrying the level, absolute calm of a surgeon who had spent decades under the bright lights of military trauma bays. I walked forward, the heavy soles of my work boots dull against the thick corporate carpet. I reached into the inner pocket of my sun coup canvas coat, the exact coat he had texted my daughter to ban from his site, and pulled out a thin, blue-labeled manila folder. I set it down directly over his forged title clearance transfer sheet. "Julian," I murmured, looking at him over the top of my reading glasses. "When you spend 40 years performing under pressure, you learn that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the worst structural bleed. You don't look powerful when you scream. You just look exposed." Arthur Cole stood up, using his silver-tipped cane to steady his limp, and gestured toward the two men who had entered the boardroom behind me. They weren't hospital security. They were senior forensic field auditors from the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation and the State Economic Security Division. "Gentlemen," Arthur announced, his deep voice slicing through the rising murmurs of the board members, "we are executing an immediate capital protective intervention under the sovereign authority of Apex Capital Trust. We have submitted a 60-page forensic audit trail directly to the board's oversight committee. Over the last 18 months, the chief administrative director, Julian Sterling, has redirected $4.5 million from the construction escrow into an unlisted offshore property partnership in the Cayman Islands. The capital has completely collapsed." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Julian's face turned the color of ash. His eyes tracked the board members as they began flipping through the audited bank trails Arthur's team had distributed. "This is a lie," Julian shouted, his arm jerking toward me. "He's an old man running a netschnack-free clinic in a rundown rail neighborhood. He doesn't have the assets, the sovereignty, or the standing to challenge an institutional medical bond." "He owns the bond, Mr. Sterling," Arthur Cole said, his voice dropping into that quiet final register that signals a door closing forever. "Thomas Vance is the sole principal beneficiary of the Apex Capital framework. He has been the silent financial anchor of this entire network for 12 years. And because you have engaged in material asset forgery, specifically forging his name to clear a $5 million off-market land theft, the $15 million mortgage balance is now officially called." Arthur slid the final document across the long walnut table. "You have 24 hours to produce the full $15 million or the title to this entire medical campus transfers to Apex Capital by noon tomorrow. And as for your administrative seat..." Arthur looked at the senior hospital trustees. The board chairman didn't wait. He didn't even look at Julian. "Effective immediately, Julian Sterling is stripped of all administrative authority, corporate access, and fiduciary credentials. We are co-signing the state's asset protection warrant." Julian collapsed back into his leather chair, the pinstripe suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume for a position he no longer held. He looked up at me, his lips parting, trying to locate that performative confidence he had used to dominate my family for 5 years. But there were no words left in his ledger. The math had caught up to him. The two state investigators stepped forward, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the silent boardroom with a sharp finality. They lifted him by the arms and led him out the side gallery doors, his pinstripe suit creased, his head lowered as the flashing cameras of a local investigative media team caught him in the hallway. Clara was standing near the elevator bank when they brought him down. She saw the cuffs, saw the state seals on the folders, and then she saw me walking out behind Arthur Cole. She took a step toward me, her eyes wet, her hands reaching out as her voice broke on a single word. "Dad?" she whispered. Julian told me it was just a formality. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know what he was doing to your clinic." I stopped. I looked at my daughter, seeing the faint shadows under her eyes and the tight, anxious pull around her mouth that Julian had spent 5 years carving into her character. I reached out, my thick, scarred hand gently covering hers for a brief second. "I know, Clara," I said softly, my voice level and dry. "You wanted to believe in the sandcastle he built, but family is a ledger where you can't cover a moral deficit with stolen land. I've taken care of the clinic, and I've taken care of you. But the rest of this, you're going to have to walk through it on your own 2 feet. I didn't stay for the media gala or the ribbon-cutting ceremony. I walked out of the 14th floor glass tower through the damp September afternoon and went back to the municipal parking garage. An hour later, I was back in the South End, sitting in the office of St. Jude's Free Clinic. The building was quiet, smelling of rubbing alcohol and old wax, the high brick walls standing steady as they had since my father's time. I took off my heavy brown canvas coat, hung it carefully on the wooden peg by the door, and rubbed the sun Q fabric at the cuffs where the white threads showed. It was an ordinary coat, bought at a farm supply store by a woman who loved me for exactly who I was. Some men spend their whole lives making noise, wearing pinstripes, and building hollow structures just to feel significant. I prefer to stay quiet, drive an old truck, and make sure that the things I build are strong enough to carry the weight when the storm finally comes. What do you think is the real difference between family loyalty and financial enabling? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being a part of this community, and I will see you on the next one.